Alright, hey you 12s. Today we're going to have a quick look at a topic that I'm calling They Just Keep Coming. Here we're going to have a look at the history between 1939 to 1946. So, let's get started. In 1939, just as, well, a few months before World War II got underway, the Colonial Secretary Malcolm MacDonald, he issued a white paper, or basically a new version of the Balfour Declaration, setting out a new British policy regarding Palestine. And basically at this point in time, the British suggested that they would allow a further 75,000 Jews to migrate into Palestine by 1944, so over the next 5-year period, at which point Palestine would become an independent binational, so that's basically a state of two nations with an Arab majority, basically to be governed jointly by Jews and Arabs, and the sale of Arab land to Jews was to be restricted. So consider how we've seen the British respond previously, where they've promised things to the two groups, and when you promise the same thing to the two groups, both of them are going to get pretty grumpy about it. So have a think about how this new policy, whether that's any different or whether it's the same as what they had been doing before, and then we'll move on to the next section. Basically, this new policy shocked the Jews in Palestine and made them quite angry. In fact, the leader of the Jewish agency in Palestine, a guy called David Ben-Gurion, he called for Jews to support the British as if there was no white paper and to oppose the white paper as if there was no war. And if we have a look at this table, this graph here, we can see the immigration of Jews into Palestine, which really, 1925 there were 34,000 there, and it dropped off during the time of the Great Depression, but as the Great Depression got worse, those figures increased even more. In fact, 1935 was where Jews came in at their peak. Right through wartime, not a whole lot of immigration during this time. We're going to see after the war that this is going to happen. It's going to leap quite significantly. So, during World War II, this is where things were at in Palestine. Most of the Jews in Palestine supported the British and what they were doing through World War II. In fact, in September 1944, there were 5,000 Jewish volunteers who had formed a Jewish brigade within the British Army, and they helped fight in Italy in campaigns in late 1944 and also in 1945. And through this time, one of the things that we need to consider is that the British were still trying to restrict Jewish migration to Palestine. They didn't want it to be a free-for-all. They wanted to make sure that they were aware of how many people were coming in and when they were doing that. In fact, Jews who were fleeing Nazi-controlled Europe, they tried to enter Palestine by boats, but they were often detained by the British on the island of Mauritius. So it's a little bit like when Australia, being really careful of asylum seekers, sends asylum seekers to Nauru or to Manus Island, basically turning back the boats. This is what the British were doing here as well. Now, who did that benefit? Well, it probably benefited the Arabs, but it also benefited the British, because if there was a massive onslaught of Jews into Palestine, then the British were going to be the ones who heard all about it, and who probably would be pushed out of Palestine. So there were about 20 to 25,000 Jews who illegally migrated between 1940 and 1945, but many ships carrying refugees were simply turned away. Having said that, there were some groups in Palestine, some Jewish groups, who didn't like what the British had been doing, and really they thought the only way that we're going to get a Jewish state is if we drive out the British out of Palestine using force. And so these two groups, the Irgun and the Lehi, basically they acted almost as terrorist groups, destroying British infrastructure. In 1944 they assassinated the British High Commissioner in Cairo, a guy called Lord Moyne, and so really they thought that their only solution was to push by force, not through peace, by force. They were going to force out the British, send them back, obviously, to Britain, allowing them to establish their own Jewish state in Palestine. And what about the Arabs? Where did they fit in all of this. Most of them were divided. Some of them supported Britain. Some of them, of course, though, supported the Axis powers in Germany, Italy, and Japan. 1,000 Arabs joined the Palestine Regiment of the British Army, formed in 1942. They were involved in the Mediterranean theatre of war. So we get to the end of World War II, and well, Britain didn't perform quite as well as perhaps they would have liked, and the Americans were the superpower that came out of that as the big name there. So the British wanted to maintain their position of dominance in the Middle East. They wanted to protect their oil fields and retain control of the oil exporting port of Haifa. And Britain and the US, they both were concerned about what the Soviet Union were going to want to do, how they were going to try and extend their influence, particularly into Turkey. And the British, their choice there was to try not to alienate the Arabs by appearing to favour Jewish statehood in Palestine. What we're going to find is that at the end of World War II and the following years, that there was this big push for Jews, having experienced what they had in the Holocaust, that almost as not payment necessarily, but to say, hey, this is what happened to you in the Holocaust. We really hate that happened. Therefore, you can have your own state. They didn't want to be seen to be involved with that, and so they tried to make sure that they weren't offending the Arabs in this process. So the Arabs living in Palestine, they wanted Jews to stop coming to Palestine. They wanted to stop Jewish immigration so that they could establish their own independent Arab state. Meanwhile, Palestinian Jews, they wanted their own Jewish state, probably achieved by partitioning the mandate. And we talked previously about how Britain had suggested, well, maybe we split a Jewish mandate, or Jewish Palestine and an Arab Palestine. They did that with an East and West split. Maybe not the best way to go. You know that I love memes, and I guess now is the time to talk about the entry of the US into the Middle East. And here's what we're going to find as we go, that the more the US tries to intervene, the more they think they've saved the city, when really they have not at all. Up until now, we haven't talked about the US. We haven't talked about their role. They've really played no part in shaping the events, because they have seen what's going on here as British responsibility. They were there first. They were the colonial power there. It was up to them to fix what was going on. And so in the Yalta Conference in 1945, President Roosevelt, he actually promised the King of Saudi Arabia that there would be no decision made about Palestine without fully consulting Arabs and Jews, and that the US were going to make sure that that had happened. They didn't want to get involved with their military, but they were certainly going to try and make sure that this took place. One of the things that we need to consider coming out of the end of World War II is this idea of misplaced persons, because the war in Europe really had left millions of people homeless and displaced. Jews who survived the Holocaust often had no place to go back to rebuild their lives, and in a lot of cases they didn't want to go back to rebuild their lives, given what had happened right throughout Europe. And so Truman, who became the US president after Roosevelt's death, which took place in 1945, Truman was concerned about Jewish displaced persons in the American-occupied sectors of Europe, so particularly in West Germany and West Berlin. And he thought that having Jews move to Palestine, that would be a good idea. He certainly didn't want to force them to do this, and he didn't want the British to force them to do this either. Just have a think though, if he's suggesting that Jews should go to Palestine, where is he suggesting that Jews maybe wouldn't go to? Why would he be suggesting that Jews not come to his country, but perhaps go somewhere else? And so in 1945, the British Foreign Minister, Ernest Bevin, he proposed a shared British-American inquiry into the future of Jewish displaced persons. What should happen to them? And he recommended that about 100,000 Jews be immediately admitted to Palestine. Now, if we remember back to that table, or the graph that we were looking at before, at no point in no year had any more than 30,000 Jews entered into Palestine, and now we're talking about potentially 100,000 of them. And so
they also believed that until all of the fighting was sorted out and it was all resolved, that Palestine should remain under the trusteeship of the UN. And they said this in the light of its long history, and particularly of its history of the last 30 years, Palestine cannot simply be regarded as either a purely Arab or a purely Jewish land. And at some point, both groups have to be able to reconcile the fact that the other one exists. And so you're not going to be able to have a Palestine that is purely Arab, you're not going to be able to have a Palestine that's purely Jewish, and so they have to find a way to coexist. That's how the Americans saw it, that's how the UN would come to see it, for the Arabs and Jews themselves, so not necessarily how they thought things were going to go. And of course Britain, well, their main concern was protecting themselves. And by protecting themselves, they wanted to make sure that they had secured a reliable and cheap source of oil, which would help to reconstruct Britain and to reconstruct Europe after the war. That was more important than the fate of a few thousand displaced persons. And so neither Britain nor the US felt that they could afford to upset the oil-producing states, places like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, Oman, Yemen. All of these are mostly Arab states, and so it was really important for them not to offend these places by proposing something that maybe these countries would resist with force if required. And so if you have a look at this map here, you can see that the main exports from most of these countries are, and here oil, petroleum, natural gas, oil, petroleum, oil. There's a lot of oil going on, and so for the big players, the big superpowers, Britain, America, Russia, really important that they have access to oil. And really one of the things that comes out of the end of World War II is the survivors of the Holocaust. And well, what do these people do? And so the Zionist movement actually used the truth of what had happened in the camps to mobilize international support. That they actually said, hey, this is what had happened to us, and therefore our objective is to establish a Jewish state in Palestine, and because of what's happened to us, you should be helping us to make this happen. In fact, during World War II, there were more than 11 million people who were forced to leave their homes, and about 200,000 of them were Jews who actually survived the Holocaust. Many of them, like I said before, couldn't return to their homes, simply didn't want to. And so, well, what did happen to them? They were often placed in camps set up by the UN, by the Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, in the American and British occupied zones in Europe. And most of these people wanted to go to Palestine. In 1947, the number of Jews in American zones in Germany was around 25,000. There were also many Jews who had returned to Europe from Soviet Central Asia, where they'd fled during the war, and then to Poland, then onto the camps. And so they basically come from east, coming back towards the west of Europe. And so, in Britain in 1945 and 1946, the first elections that were held in Britain for over 10 years, a Labour government was elected. And this new government continued the policy of preventing illegal Jewish immigration to Palestine, and they basically became obsessed with preventing Jews from arriving. Why? Because they were concerned with protecting their own interests, and they didn't want to offend the Arab populations. And so what continued to happen? Well, Jewish resistance groups, they continued their attacks on British military and civilian targets. They bombed infrastructure, they bombed trains, railway stations, bridges. You can see some of that in the photos there and in the newspaper headline. In August 1946, the group Irgun, they were responsible for a bomb that destroyed part of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, one of the most famous hotels in all of Jerusalem, in fact, killing 9 people. And basically the British, they lacked the resources to defend Palestine from these Jewish groups. And so in February 1947, the issue of Palestine was referred to the United Nations. Basically, Britain tried to wash their hands of the mess and say, alright, we don't know what's going to happen now. It's up to the UN to decide, because if we try and do it, we're going to offend way too many people. And so if the UN can work it out, then we're all sweet.
What we're going to find, though, is that things weren't all sweet. So please make sure you watch this video before class, and then we'll have a look at a whole heap of activities when we get there.